hearing the voices that are gathered here today, your voices of love and grace. And as I was listening to you sing today, it made me think about how God has given us so much. So many amazing gifts. And I see those gifts in you gathered here in this congregation today. God's blessing coming through each one of you on this day. So much for which to be thankful. I'm thankful for a congregation like MCCDC where we can come and strengthen each other in our values so that we can live our values in a world where it's not easy to live our values. In a world where there is so much anger and hatred, we need a place where we can come and have the strength that we need to face that kind of world. Every day there's those tweets that go out that draw me to my knees to pray for our nation and for our world. Our drummer, Chris, reminded me today of a post on Facebook that I think more fully expresses our values. It says, "Tweet others as you wish to be tweeted." And I think we can help others to do that. We have been given so much. And today's scripture asks a question about what we've been given. Today's scripture asks, what will we do with what we have been given? Will we protect it, or will we risk it? Will we bury it, or will we reveal it? Will we hold on to it, or will we let it go? Today's parable, today's gospel, is a parable about how we choose to live our lives. In our scripture today, two chose to take the generosity, the gifts that had been given to them, and risk them. One, on the other hand, played it safe. In reflecting on this scripture, I asked myself, what was the difference between these people? They all had gifts, different gifts, yes, but they all had gifts. What made the difference? I think the answer to that question is revealed in the response of the non-risk taker who said to the generous landowner, "Knowing your harshness, you who reap where you did not sow and gather where you did not scatter, and fearing your anger, I went off and buried your $1,000 in the ground. Here is your money back." The key word there is fearing. Fearing to use the gift that had been given, and ultimately squandering the generosity of the landowner. Now, why was this third one afraid and the other two not afraid? I think it's because the one who buried the gifts locked in to a distorted perception of the landowner. The third one saw the landowner as someone who was harsh and did not see that the landowner indeed was generous. In fact, later we see this coming through when the landowner says, "Well done, you good and faithful workers. Since you were trustworthy in small matters, I will put you in charge of larger affairs. Come and share my joy." The first two could imagine that statement coming from the landowner. Come and share the joy. The third one could only see the harshness and acted in fear. And it makes me think, what choices would we make if we really believed that our God was a God of grace and generosity? What choices would we make if we really trusted that God is indeed God, the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end? What if we believed in God as much as God believed in us? What if indeed we believe that with God we cannot fail? We see distorted perceptions causing distorted fear. And yet the opportunity coming through our scripture is to boldly risk. It's to view life and faith not as trying to please an unpleasable God, but rather an adventure worth the risk. And we see Jesus, the controversial, radical rabbi, being one who is a risk taker, who invites us to risk, and on the other side of that risk, seeing joy. When Jesus tells this story, he is entering his final days. He knows he'll be facing difficulty and pain. Yet beneath all of that, there is a deeper joy that helps him to continue to walk a steady walk towards Jerusalem. Jesus had no place to lay his head, and yet he lived with an open and full heart. Come on the adventure, Jesus says. You have so much. Now is the time to share your gifts, your talents, your dreams, your ideas, your energy. Everybody has something to share. Even fisher people. They found their security in their fishing nets. That's what they've been taught all their lives. But the radical rabbi invited them to release what little they had on a venture of faith that opened the way to new possibilities for themselves and to others. The call of Jesus is an adventure. It's a call to invest deeply, a call to care deeply, to give our hearts away and risk everything on God. To lose is to gain, Jesus says, and he invites us to ponder that paradox while moving forward in holy ambiguity. Jesus, the risk taker, took a risk on us. He left the safety of Galilee for the turbulence of Jerusalem. He became a threat to the status quo. He became a disturber of the peace. And people saw a new window into heaven and to God, a God of grace and also a God of justice. So what ways are we called to risk as individuals? To risk is to rise. What ways are we called to risk as a congregation? I, for one, am grateful that back in 1971, 12 risk takers gathered on Capitol Hill to dream a dream of a congregation called MCCDC. We see stories of risk after risk in those who've gone before us and also in the Bible. Risk opens the way to miracles. I think of the woman who was suffering with a hemorrhage for 12 years. And she had this conversation in her heart and in her head. Perhaps Jesus is the source of my healing. And she took that risk to reach out and touch the hem of his garment. And she was healed through her risk. And Jesus said to her the words she'd been longing to hear for those 12 years, "Daughter, your faith has made you well." Risk takers. Last Sunday we honored our veterans. Veterans who have taken a risk, who have stepped out to serve our country, who have stepped out to stand for good and for what is right. And I was so proud last week to see you so proud in honoring our vets. Tomorrow night will be the Transgender Day of Remembrance service. And we will hear the stories of those who have been called to step out and to live their full and their true lives. I'm thankful for the heroes and the sheroes who live their best selves. What's clear in this scripture that ultimately the greatest risk is not to risk. J. Buchanan said it this way: the greatest risk is not to care deeply and profoundly enough about anything to invest deeply. To give your heart away and in the process to risk everything. The greatest risk of all, it turns out, is to play it safe, to live cautiously and prudently. Give your best. Give your all. Risk it all. Stand up for what is right. Do as the Spirit calls you to do. And you will hear the words of Jesus when Jesus says, "Well done, my good and faithful beloveds. Well done. Come and share my joy." The joy of risk is the joy of life. To not risk is to die from the inside out. To risk everything is to offer everything to the grace of God. knowing that God will take the investments of our lives and multiply them beyond our imagination. Come, share my joy, Jesus says. Amen.